Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Jeffery. I'm back for part 2 of the 2023 Treasury Fraud and Controls Survey podcast with Omri Kletter from Bottomline Technologies. Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast discussion, Omri.
Good to be here again. Good to be here in part 2 too.
Oh, excellent. So I'm going to assume that people have listened to part 1. I'm not going to do the whole preamble other than to say a lot of this data, you can find it in the show notes. You can find the report, the public-facing report. It's the 8th year in a row that we've done this survey together, Strategic Treasury and Bottomline Technologies. So for the key areas, we're going to jump into the third area. This is the idea of, every fraud or every attack usually goes against the weakest link, right? If someone strengthens their defenses in one area, they target other areas. Certainly criminals are trying to find everything. So attacking the weakest point is a good strategy and one that's commonly used by criminals. Staff has been an area that's been exploited for a long time. It's tremendously vulnerable. But there's a couple other facts about an unguarded asset or location, let's say, of key banking information. These would be unmonitored directories. If you think about banking information, it's oftentimes stored in a ERP or a payment system or a treasury system or a payment hub. Then there's some kind of process of delivering those instructions to, let's say, a bank or a third party to settle it. The protection of unmonitored directories does not seem to be very strong based on information. Less than 40% had a full audit trail of access and changes to access. Only about a third of administrators who can assign rights to access that do not have the ability to edit or delete log files. So 2/3 basically have the ability to cover up the trails. And even if everyone was perfectly pure and noble in all that they do, if someone gained their credentials, the keys to cover up their tracks exist. This seems to be a significant thing. We've seen this in our practice. Omri, I'd love you to talk about this generally, but also how companies, how networks are addressing these types of concerns.
Absolutely. And to whom of you who followed the webinar and may now connect the dots, one of the things that we've mentioned over there, and I think it's obviously very relevant for our discussion today, is the notion that additionally to detect and to score the payments, right, and to see money movement from A to B and to have all the profilings and all the different things that we'll do and all the account takeover mechanisms and email verification, all the things that we're doing in multi-factor authentication. We also need to monitor the junctions where fraud can take place. And network directories, payment directories are critical places. By the way, not necessarily for the attack itself, but the things to facilitate the attack. To your point, who is accessing? Who is downloading? Who is modifying? Was it allowed, not allowed? Who is accessing? All these things are critical. And one of the things that we are extremely focused on is to provide this visibility. We have one tool, we call it record and replay. So we're allowing our customers to record who is coming in, who is coming out to these key network directories. And by the way, we do it if on one hand, you actually extra need it in places that you don't have the logs, mainframe, for example. So you're talking about leaving the ability to change the traces or to modify the traces. In some cases, especially in mainframe, you don't have even traces because you don't have these things being logged properly. So the notion that we want to, what we call, quote unquote, record and replay, to record what's happening in these network junctions and to have the ability to then almost trigger an alert before the attack, right? Because these are things that will later enable the attack, say, hey, something looking wrong from an access perspective, something looking weird from someone who's trying to modify something. And we start to see great value over there.
That's great. I like that. I imagine that's like watching a movie, not just saying these IDs had access or these functions were done, but see what's occurred. I imagine that allows you to see whether that's a machine, a system doing it, or it's a person exploring or a person or a criminal attempting to commit the fraud there. So yeah, appreciate that depth. Yeah. So as we move off of this idea of unmonitored directories or these points of exposure, the other thing that was interesting to me from both the research here, but also something we've seen over time, banks know a lot about fraud because they've seen a lot of fraud with their customers primarily. They're in the business of protecting payments. They educate their customers, and not everybody listens to the banks. They listen to the banks after they've had fraud, but they don't always listen to them ahead of time. And so since they know about it, they're pretty smart and pretty knowledgeable, just like a company that's in the security business. But what are banks telling us that they wish their customers did? And what would you add to this list, right? They have a particular perspective. You have some additional degrees of separation that might help us understand what to do.
Perfect setup for this question. So absolutely agree with you, Craig. There is nothing more valuable than more and more treasuries working much closer with banks and finding ways to do all the relevant things, from inner treasury education to ensure controls and processes in place. In some cases, and we supported some of our bank clients on that, allowing some treasuries to review the alerts as if they were the bank, right? Just to have especially for big corporate organizations, to have the ability to score and review payments within the organization. So all these things are definitely viable and important. I think there is more to be done on scoring internal risk. Absolutely. And I think banks are, and I know it from many of them that are talking with them, feeling that treasuries can do more on having their processes, the whistleblower processes, the 4 eyes reviews, the management, all the things that can both protect from internal risk because of malicious wrongdoing, but also from negligence and being vulnerable for account takeover or social engineering, et cetera, et cetera. We know that business compromise is more highly to take place in organizations when they don't have culture of see something, say something, right? And you say something problematic and you say something. So there is a connect. I think banks, first I would say, I think you're right. Organizations and corporates should work much closer with the banks partnerships. I would argue that one of the reasons the banks are doing better because they are having ways to communicate with each other. And I think treasuries should start to do more around it. I think that's where the regulator and some payment vehicles or payment organizations and associations should set the scene for that. The UK, by the way, is doing quite a good job in facilitating that. I am yet to see what is the CIFAS equivalent in the US for CIFAS in the UK. Technology is many times 10 times more advanced in the US, but in terms of building, I would say, mechanisms and industry bodies to support the different organizations talking and working together, there is still room for development.
Yeah, that idea of sharing information to protect against a common criminal is certainly paying off quite well. They try to repeat what they do many times, but if it's identified and squelched or extinguished early, that's great. A couple things came up on what banks wished their customers would do. The top 4 items. The fourth one was have regular security training and testing. We've seen banks do a much better job with this over time. Essentially, we're right at about 100% of banks do this regularly with training and testing. More of them are doing it on a recurring basis as opposed to just annually. Corporations are doing that as well. They never seem to stop emphasizing that. Dual controls, multi-factor authentication, wherever possible, 67%. I think our audience is probably pretty clued into that. 2 things. One is reconcile their accounts quickly, preferably the same day, but definitely within a week. That's 69% are saying reconcile. And, Omri, I guess one of those things is reconciliation means something has already happened. So why does it matter to do that quickly?
Why it's important to do this type of reconciliation quickly?
Yeah, let's say you already had a loss. Why is it important to do it quickly.
We talked about it on the webinar, fraud follows speed, right? So we need to be ready to have a better mechanisms of reporting and reconciliation. That's for sure. I think the regulator will step in and ask more from organizations to do so. It will also make us better aligned or better prepared for new technologies or new methodologies around money movement and reporting, and sometimes, by the way, claw back the money. I think one of the things that the industry definitely will do more is to find ways to have money recovery even after loss, and post factum, and asking more organizations to do more around detecting mule accounts that are usually the receiving end, and then obviously go cash it out with crypto or with other types of cashing out techniques. I think this is critical to get things in order later when regulation comes, or new technology or new type of payment that will ask us to act much faster, so we are prepared to do it properly.
Fraud follows speed, and speed matters in detection because you can stop future events. You can sometimes call it back or stop it. Good points. The most frequently listed one is not really biased, in my opinion. It's use payment control services. I think largely they're referring to payment control services that the banks offer, but there's certainly others. And this makes tremendous sense that people would avail themselves of commercially reasonable procedures that are quite affordable to protect themselves. So any final words as we close out this discussion about fraud and controls, payment fraud?
I'm looking forward to see, obviously, how the industry will continue to evolve and how the next year's statistics will see. I've said also during the webinar, people ask, okay, it's 300 responded. In the live data that we're seeing across the globe, it's definitely aligned with that. So I can definitely echo what's being on data, and I would definitely treat it with with professionalism, and also I see many of the items there as a call for action. And I urge anyone who is listening to this podcast and would like to learn more, say, hey, Omri mentioned record and play. What does it mean? Can we really record what's happening on these directories, or talk about the regulator and, hey, Omri, what's going in the UK and what can we learn from confirmation of pay? I'm more than welcome to continue these discussions, reach out on LinkedIn or another way, and we'll find ways to make this just as a first date.
Very good. Well done, Omri. Thank you for joining me on the Treasury Update podcast. Again, really appreciate your comments, insight, and energy on this topic.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.